Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you and a very warm welcome. My name is Genevieve Jacobs. I'm the Group Editor for Region Media, a rapidly growing, entirely independent regional news platform. And I'm here with you on behalf of the Riverina and Orana RDAs. Coming to you this morning from currently lockdown Canberra, but I'm also the daughter, wife and mother of farmers from West Wyalong and Cootamundra. So I'm delighted to be a virtual MC for this Inland Housing Summit, and it promises to be a significant, important forum unpacking the issues around inland regional housing. And I think you all know how complex an issue this is, especially for areas like Orana and Riverina, where there are diverse areas of economic growth, pressure from tree changers who are moving the demographic needle, multiple factors that make it increasingly hard for many people to put a roof over their heads affordably, and consequently to meet workforce needs and to empower future growth. Our summit today is going to examine why inland areas are in crisis, what can be done to resolve the problem, and also who's responsible for addressing those issues. We're following in the footsteps of past inland growth summits run by the Orana RDA, and today Riverina is a major partner. And the significance of these discussions is that they help us to get concerns to government leaders, business representatives and community members to spread awareness of the concerns about what's happening on the ground in regional areas. Your role as participants is therefore very important, and I want to encourage you to participate fully in our sessions today, even if you're doing so from the comfort of your own home with a cuppa on one side. You can ask questions by typing them into the question box that you'll see on the right-hand bottom corner of your screen. For most of the sessions today, we will reserve questions for the end of the session. We've allowed about 10 minutes or so, but please enter those questions as they pop up, whenever they cross your mind. And you can also upvote questions that others have entered if you'd really like to see them addressed. And then I'll put those questions to our speakers at the end of each session. We also encourage you to share your thoughts throughout the day on your social media. You can use the hashtag IGSHousing21, hashtag RDA Orana, hashtag RDA Riverina, and then we're able to reshare your content. But for now, I'd like to formally begin by acknowledging the places on which we meet and their traditional owners, wherever you may be. And I'd like to now invite Aunty Cheryl Penrith to give us her welcome to country.
Yudumarang, Nadu Cheryl Penrith, Wiradjuri Yina. G'day everybody, my name's Cheryl Penrith, I'm a Wiradjuri woman. I'm zooming in today from Wagga. I think it's a really hard time for a lot of people, and I think this summit was planned to be face-to-face, so I think it's a great job that it's happened. And I'm really honoured by the Inland Growth Summit Housing in 2021 and RDA Orana Riverina to be able to perform the Welcome to Country. A welcome to country is a really important protocol practiced by Wiradjuri people over thousands of years as we welcome people onto country. And when people are on country, they become our responsibility. So it's a really important protocol. A really important thing for Wiradjuri people is Yinjamara, which is respect. So respect for yourself, respect for other people, and respect for country. I'd like to pay my respects and acknowledge all the countries that you're zooming in from, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri, who are our close cousins up there in Canberra. And I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to other First Nations people that might be on the Zoom today. I'd like to welcome you all to Wiradjuri country. Go way Umbana. Welcome to Wiradjuri country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aunty Cheryl, and I too would like to pay my respects to the Wiradjuri people, the traditional owners of your country and the country on which I was born too, and any other elders who may be present, and to commit myself to ongoing acts of reconciliation. I'd like to now welcome Brad Cam, who is the chair of RDA Orana, and Dianna Somerville, who is the chair of RDA Riverina, to formally begin today's events.
Thank you, Genevieve, and very big thank you to Aunty Cheryl for your welcome to country. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of where everyone is meeting today, and I'm actually joining you also from Wiradjuri country, just outside of Wagga Wagga, in a small town called Collingully, with my cuppa in hand, Genevieve, from home on the farm. So for those of you that don't know, RDA Riverina spans from Hay in the west all the way through to Tumut in the east, covering Griffith and Wagga Wagga and many other regional centres. It's a very diverse region of which I am extremely proud and fortunate to represent as the chair of RDA Riverina. As many of you know, and this is why we're here today, housing affordability and availability are major barriers to growth and prosperity in regional Australia, and not just in the Riverina and Orana regions, but right across regional Australia. Hence why we wanted to bring this summit to the forefront. And this problem has only been catalysed by COVID-19. And that's putting a lot of pressure on materials and access to materials, access to trades and workers to build our housing, and also the pressure of all of those great city-based people looking to move to more. And we want to capture this opportunity and ensure we retain a sustainable and livable region. So today is about connecting ideas and also solutions to the people that can affect the change that's needed to ensure that sustainability and livability. I'd like to thank all our sponsors and supporters who have assisted in getting us here today. They have helped us bring an extremely insightful group of speakers for you to listen to today. I'd especially like to thank Megan Dixon and Rachel Whiting, who have worked tirelessly to put this together and in very trying circumstances. So thank you both. As Genevieve mentioned, the Inland Growth Summits are an amazing platform that were developed by RDA Orana, and we are very, very grateful to be partnering with RDA Orana in bringing you this Inland Growth Summit for housing. I'd now like to pass over to RDA Orana Chair Brad for his welcome, and please enjoy the day. Thanks.
Thank you, Diane, and welcome everyone. And I too like to acknowledge the traditional owners and on the lands in which we all meet. It is a very exciting time, as Diane said, and I welcome you to the Riverina and Orana RDA Inland Growth Summit. I also would like to thank our sponsors and also the speakers that we have throughout the day. It's very exciting to see the diverse speakers. The Orana region, like the Riverina, is very diverse and very broad, running to the west to Cobar and to the east in Mudgee and right up to Canamble and everything in between. We are experiencing an unprecedented growth with over $5 billion worth of state significant infrastructure that's going to be built over the next 5 years or more. And of course, housing is playing a critical role in that, and that will be critical in its success over the next 5 or 6 years. So I am looking forward, and I hope all of you are as well, to the day and find the insights and the needs that we need to have for both Riverina and RDA to address the housing needs of our regional communities. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Brad, and thank you, Diana. And indeed, we're persevering through difficult times, and that's constrained our ability to meet, but not our ability to think and respond to these critical issues for our economic future in the inland regions. To officially open our event, I'd like to now introduce the Hon Mark Coulton MP. He's the National Party member for Parks since 2007, and he served as the Minister for Regional Health, Regional Communications and Local Government in the Morrison government from 2020 to 2021. And he will be followed by someone I know is very familiar to all of you and a great enthusiast for RDAs and the work they do around Australia. That's the Honourable Nola Marino, the Assistant Minister for Regional Development and Territories and the Member for Forest.
Yeah, g'day. Welcome to the summit. The RDA putting on another Regional Growth Summit. They're doing a great job promoting issues that are important right across our region. Unfortunately, obviously, I can't make it. I'm going to be in Condo today, and we're all doing virtual anyway. But I think the focus on housing is really important, and the federal government, in the budget, did make some allowances, 30,000 places for first home owner buyers with reduced deposit, single parent families, and the like, which I think certainly need following up. But the real issue we have at the moment is lack of housing. It's not so much the affordability of people being able to rent them or purchase them. It's just actually lack of stock, and it's not a bad problem to have, I've got to say. It's a serious problem, but a lot of the communities now that don't have housing, not that many years ago, were offering farmhouses for $1 a week just to attract people to come there. So it's a symptom of the fact that the regions now are now a focus for people to want to move and take up employment or live in the regions and maintain their employment elsewhere. But it's a positive thing, and I think that over time we will get on top of this issue. Just recently I was at Bourke and opened some teacher accommodation with the Forbes Wilkenya Diocese of the Catholic Church, tied up with St Ignatius School in Bourke for teacher housing. 4 houses built out at North Bourke, and I think it was a good example, a combination obviously between the federal government, who put in some funding towards it, but also the local diocesan school, understanding that if we really want to get quality people to come and work in these regions, we've got to supply housing. And those houses were transportable ones that were purchased, bought in, so overcame a bit of the issue of the lack of local tradespeople. Obviously, there were some tradespeople to do it, but it was a great project, and I think that we are going to have to look outside the box at projects like this to encourage people to actually invest in housing, whether they are employees or even investors to understand that there is a return. But you're about to hear from my good friend and colleague Nola Marino. Nola is from Western Australia. She and I turned up in Canberra the same day. She's the Assistant Minister for Regional Development. Anyone in the RDA would know Nola. She's done a great job in promoting the work of the RDAs in Canberra, and she's a fierce advocate for the regions, a really good friend of mine, and I'm great privilege that I have to introduce Nola to you now, who will address your conference. Thanks very much.
Hello, thank you everyone for your participation today, and a big thank you to RDA Riverina Chair Dianna Somerville and all the RDA Riverina board, as well as to Rachel Whiting and our RDA staff for the invitation to speak and for your work in setting up this event. It's a big effort, but thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners right across the country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, I attended the first Inland Growth Summit held by RDA Orana in Dubbo. That was in February, and this was a great success. So I'm really pleased that RDA Riverina has taken up this opportunity to continue this work. Now, I note that this meeting has had to move online due to COVID, and I also acknowledge all those people who may be in lockdown currently. Thank you for what you're doing to keep your family, your community, and more of Australia safe. And I think it's again worth noting the important work of our RDAs, what they've done since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Your work has lifted the profile and value of the RDA network, and in turn, the importance of regional Australia. The regional intelligence bulletins have proven to be a very valuable tool, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, when it was critical that government had access to information to build a really clear picture of what was happening in regional Australia. And I look at how RDAs have learned from each other to try and find regional solutions and opportunities through our regional phone hookups. Now, there's a range of programs being delivered by RDAs right around Australia. And they're supporting their communities, including working directly with business to help encourage and implement some really innovative ideas. And our RDAs are working together more than ever before, collaborating and building new networks across the regions to explore and address the barriers and the opportunities for growth right across inland and regional Australia. Now, as we heard at this year's conference in Canberra, all are working in this space. And I've repeatedly said it's so important that our RDAs seek to engage with state and local government as well. Our federal system means the key to some issues may rest at other levels of government, or perhaps even require a collective response across multiple levels of government. Now, we all know that regional people are incredibly resourceful, and mateship and supporting one another is in our DNA. We are always stronger for working together and working regionally, pooling our resources and our intellectual capital, our grassroots knowledge, but also through building goodwill. By helping others, we also help ourselves. And problems don't care about excuses, and you all understand this. You are all participating today because you are genuinely focused on getting on with the job. We are all aware of the issues facing regional Australia and inland and remote areas. The benefit of forums such as this is that we start to shift our mind from the problems to the solutions. So I encourage you to be a really active participant today. Again, thank you for all your work. I look forward to hearing of more practical solutions emerging from this forum, and I hope everyone has a really enjoyable and productive day. Good luck, and please stay safe.
Thank you so much, Minister, for your customary enthusiasm. Our next speaker is the Honourable Melinda Pavey MP, who's the New South Wales Minister for Water, Property and Housing. She's been a member of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly since 2015, representing the seat of Oxley for the Nationals, and has previously served as the Minister for Roads, Maritime and Freight. Melinda grew up on a dairy farm in regional Victoria, and she's absolutely passionate about advocating for rural communities and issues that matter to families across the state. Welcome, Minister.
Well, good morning, everybody. What a thrill to be here and following Mark and Nola. And we're a little bit ahead of time. So does that mean I get an extra length in my speech? But there is so much to talk about. And to hear the first speaker today address a magnificent problem we have. I think it was $5 billion in infrastructure spending to be done within the RDA region. That is a problem in the sense that it will create and is creating pressure for housing. And it's an absolute delight to join you today to talk to those issues and how we're getting in front of those problems. And I would say that probably the thing that we've been working on actually for about 18 months, the first ever housing strategy in New South Wales, is a really, really important foundational document to get to the basics of what we need to improve so we can actually get more housing into our regions. And I just would like to call out to my friend, Rick Furman, who invited me in relation to his position as chair of the Joint Organisation of Councils to be with you today. And his own community of Temora. I was saying to a meeting of Central West Mayors yesterday that my most favourite meeting this year has been with Temora Council. And sadly, Rick wasn't there, but the general manager was there, and the head of Argyle Housing, a community housing group throughout the Riverina, Wendy, was there from Argyle Housing. Anyway, they presented to me and they talked about council having donated essentially a significant block of land in the centre of Temora to Argyle Housing. and they were going to build 17 villas on this block of land for the community. And it was going to be funded through the National Housing Infrastructure Fund, NIFIC. And I thought, wow, this is great. And then, you know, as a minister, you're waiting for the ask. And I said, so what do you want from me? And they said, nothing. And I'm like, that's my type of meeting. Because what it showed was the ingenuity of Temora, the capacity of their community housing provider, Argyle Housing, to actually be able to look at the assets they have and uplift that asset of that land into housing for the community. I just wish I had an Argyle Housing across the whole of New South Wales. And Argyle Housing's also been instrumental looking at reimagining and revisioning the Tolland estate in Wagga Wagga, and some major work that we are doing in Griffith with Griffith City Council. Also acknowledge we're doing great work with Tolland with Argyle, blue chip community housing provider, as well as Wagga City Council. There is no blame game here. This is something, housing and dealing with this housing supply issue is something that we need to do together, not one level of government. So we've got the capacity to borrow funds from when Scott Morrison as Prime Minister was Treasurer set up this National Housing Infrastructure Fund, which is a really, really important porthole for community housing providers to provide housing on a very, very low interest rate. Then you've got state government, and I know that we have challenges in terms of planning and changing maybe the zonings of land and, you know, the contributions that we have to have for developers. And I know there's a lot of complications in that sector, but we are partners in this as well. And I think where you have local government willing to participate is a really important aspect. Another important part of what we're doing is actually looking at what land we have. In our housing strategy, we actually said it's important that the state government understands every piece of land it owns across New South Wales. It had been done in 2008 by the federal government, and they had something like 25,000 parcels of land, which is now available on a website. So we followed suit. We'd seen what the feds had done, and I got my agency to prepare that same public portal to the people of New South Wales. The only difference was there ended up being 250,000 parcels of land. And I'm talking about Crown land, I'm talking about Education Department, Transport land, Police land, all parcels of land throughout New South Wales. And there was some in the opposition that criticised me for this, saying, oh, I'm just trying to sell off all the land in New South Wales and make a buck. No, what I was doing and what we are doing as a government, as we underlined in our housing strategy, is showing the community who owns what and where and what zoning it has. And you can find this on Government Property Index, just Google it. And that is an important conversation starter, because who hasn't driven past a piece of land that's vacant, that's not doing anything, and you think, oh, I wonder who owns that land. I wonder what they're going to do with that land. And that was the genesis of creating this index, which is now live. And a very big important part of that is land that is Crown land, that is in the jurisdiction of my portfolio. And in establishing this, it became very clear, and I think this is an important conversation for those of us in the country, in particular, which I have responsibility for, Crown lands in regional New South Wales, is that Crown lands was meant to be the next stage of land for housing in towns. And I think it's important for us to keep that in mind. I also think it's very, very important for us to be able to have good conversations with our local Indigenous representatives, because there is also a lot of land that has now been, through the process of land rights, been handed over through to local land councils. And that is another area where we can have new land available close to town without the big cost of delivering all services. So they're very exciting parts of our strategy. The other one is our Housing Advisory Council. We're yet to formally announce the members of that council, But the really good thing is it's going to have representatives of local government. It's going to have representatives of the social housing groups. It's going to have representatives of builders as well as property developers, dare I say it, because it is important that we have everybody that is in the continuum of delivering homes as part of that conversation, so that we can get rid of the barriers as best as we can to ensure a more seamless supply of homes to our communities across New South Wales. And I'm also delighted that Gary Fielding is heading up a housing industry task force. So he's getting around the state. He'll feed into our council and deal with those issues. But I don't think it's what we can't fix this in Macquarie Street. We can fix it alongside working with the people in the main streets of all our major towns and communities, and that is happening. I'm also very keen, and we're having these conversations in cities like Albury and Coffs Harbour, and there are other cities where we can do it. Nothing is more irritating to me than seeing hectares of land with, old fibro homes or not fit for purpose homes on a quarter-acre block. So we are having conversations with councils about changing the zoning so we can have some medium density. We can redevelop those areas, put a little bit more social housing in, but also then sell off to first home buyers other properties so that you're creating more of a supply chain, as well as changing the makeup of those estates. Every international research shows that it is important to have a mix of communities living in an area. So you change a lot of dynamics at the same time, and that will be a very, very important footing as we go forward to ensure that, that we have more homes going in. Let me also give you an example. I know that the RDA encompasses the Snowy region, which is our Deputy Premier member and leader of the National Party's seat, John Barilaro, and he's very proud of the work that's happening with Snowy Hydro 2.0. But he's also been very concerned about the supply chain of homes within the district to look after the amount of workers that are coming through. And as it turned out, Land and Housing, my agency, had a block of land not far from town, but it was also on a very steep block and it didn't have services to it. We were happy to help and facilitate more housing on that. And then somebody was driving through and identified a piece of Crown land. I'm sure they went to our government property index, and we're having conversations now about some more housing closer to town without the big landscaping and earth moving costs of building into hills, and more central to services as well as transport and all of those sort of things. So they're the type of conversations that we are very willing to have with a community to ensure that, that we can improve that housing supply. I mean, I heard Mark Coulton at the beginning say, and I do remember there was a television show where we were renting out farmhouses at $1 a week. I mean, that was only about 10 years ago. We should celebrate and be excited by this turnaround in the fortunes of regional New South Wales. And it hasn't come by chance. It's come by strategic investment by state and federal governments, the work that we're doing for the South on Wyangla Dam. I might also point out, as Water Minister, the amazing amount of work that's going to come forward in improving the health of the Murray and the Murrumbidgee with enormous investments from the Murray-Darling Basin Authority to ensure that we have better outcomes for our farmers, as well as our communities, as well as native fish. I've been working really hard behind the scenes with Keith Pitt to give relevance and to listen to what our communities have been saying. So that's going to be another big infrastructure spend, which is going to require workers, which is going to require homes. So it is really, really important that we all work together to ensure that we have the capacity to have staff. And I'm also, pleased to announce that another initiative from my agency was that about 12 months ago, we sent a text message to every tenant in social housing, advising them of a $60 million TAFE program that we'd established to ensure that we had the builders and the tradies of tomorrow. The take up of that has been strong. because, you know, we know how hard it is to get a tradie in a country town at the moment. And so we're very much investing in those skills and that workforce of the future. So that has been a really positive development. It is, as I said, a very positive issue that we are having to deal with across New South Wales at the moment. We have a record spend in public housing in New South Wales. We have twice the amount of public housing than Victoria does. We are consuming and drawing down about 80% of the national housing infrastructure funds because we have the settings right. We have our community housing providers like Argyle Housing. But I also believe there is enormous capacity for many of our own community groups that provide housing to older people in our communities, that they've done so for decades and decades without really any government intervention. And I know Steph Cook has introduced me from your region, some of those players, and I have those in my region. But there is a real capacity for those to become low-key community housing providers themselves and get funding from NIFIC to do redevelopments, to improve or grow the density of stock throughout our communities. Also working with groups like Legacy. Legacy was born and created virtually in regional New South Wales at the end of World War II, looking after those returned servicemen's wives and families. And we know there's a lot of legacy accommodation in New South Wales that also needs to be revitalised and improved. We're working with particular chapters of legacy to look at those opportunities. I give you those as examples because, as I keep saying, this is not Macquarie Street to solve. It's not Canberra. This is a joint effort between us all, looking at the assets we have, creating the pathways, developing those conversations, and between us all, I am very confident we can fix that supply chain. And I acknowledge that the amazing work being done in councils like Temora, like Griffith, like Wagga, like Albury, and I want to do it everywhere. We have the capacity, and I know that our local members on the ground are very keen to assist in that. It's a great conference that you're having today. I sort of wish that we could take questions, and I'm very happy to take questions if you like, Genevieve. And because I think I was due to start speaking now, so we might have some time to take some questions, which is always a really good way to interact with the people that I'm speaking with.
Look, I'm certainly, Minister, I'm very happy for people to put questions into the Slido device on their screens if you've got any. I've got that open in front of me now. I do have a question from Dr. Caroline Hong on the Mid-North Coast, who merely asks whether there'll be a recording when everything is finished, because obviously the information is terrifically useful. And yes, there will be. And Caroline is saying hello to everyone. So look, again, if you do have a question for the Minister, we've got a couple of minutes up our sleeve, go to that live now. So you use the screen to your right to type the questions and get involved in the discussion on inland housing pressures and the solutions that perhaps government's able to offer in collaboration with other providers. Minister, just perhaps very quickly from me, that $5 billion infrastructure spend that we identified a little earlier on, there's going to be pressure on housing undoubtedly. So it is a sort of a vexed question, isn't it? We need this to kickstart the growth, but it's about trying to find that sweet spot where the injection of economic benefit into the regions meets the region's ability to provide for that growth. And I guess that's what today is all about, essentially.
Yeah, and we haven't even spoken to the capacity on a lot of blocks of land in our country towns are over that 800 square metre capacity. I'm not a planning minister, I'm social housing minister, but we all know intuitively that, you know, there is the capacity for granny flats. There is the capacity for internal subdivision on existing blocks of land. It's, as the Mid-North Coast delegates that are listening, you know, it is something that's happening up here. And I think that is a really, really positive way to provide accommodation for workers, for students in our bigger cities. But, you know, it's also great accommodation then for the grandchildren, or the families that want to visit. It's with Airbnb the way it's going, and I think we're going to be in this, you know, confined travel space to explore our own magnificent country for some time. You know, I think, you know, take this opportunity to, with, you know, such low interest rates as well, invest in your own properties where you have that capacity and the council, you know, zonings to allow that to happen. That's also a really important and powerful conversation to be having with ourselves and as communities to provide that sort of capacity into the future. And you know, that could be something delivered by councils or RDAs, information nights about what capacity you have on your own blocks of land, and then join up with people that are providing these type of, you know, mobile accommodation, which they can actually just shift in, or they can build it fresh, whatever people want to do. Just bringing knowledge to people so they can take up those opportunities is always a powerful thing.
Minister, asking you shall receive. I've got about 5 or 6 questions here who've all come in the last couple of minutes. One asks, are we able to see the list of government-owned land? You mentioned the index a moment ago. Are local communities able to ask to utilise in this some way?
Absolutely.
Yes.
This is the exciting thing. So when I announced this in the New South Wales Parliament, I had the opposition, the Labor Party and the Greens saying to me, oh, how dare you? You want to sell, you want to tell everybody who owns what? I went, yes, because it's not my land. It's not Gladys's land. It's not John Barilaro's land. It's the people's land. And it's slack. It's terrible if we don't actually have a proper audit and understanding of what land we have. As Property Minister, I'm invested in the people of New South Wales to ensure that they get the best results, the best return on investments, and that every piece of land we have is properly utilised to the benefit of the people of New South Wales. So yeah, Government Property Index, we'll send you the actual link of it, Genevieve, and get it up on screen so people can see it and start thinking about it and having those conversations within a community.
Okay. A question from Stuart who says, look, I'm sick of hearing about Crown Land being the saviour. He thinks it's too complicated. We've got the ability to get freehold online faster if the government gets serious. Stuart says, Victoria's spending an extra $5.3 billion on new social and key worker housing. Does New South Wales have a similar investment program that RDAs could support?
We do have a massive investment going on, as I said, partnering up with our community housing providers and tapping into the loan arrangements that the Commonwealth has provided. We had a $900 million boost to our budget for 1 year last year. As I said earlier, we've got twice as much social housing as Victoria. We want our model to be less reliant on the New South Wales taxpayer going forward. Victoria is trying to catch up with what we've done, but we believe the equity and the land we have, coupled with the money that we are investing, record spend last year, can deliver more housing. But it's not just up to government. It is up to us all to work together to collaborate. I do take up the point that dealing with Crown lands can be difficult, agree. And, you know, we're trying to streamline some of those pressures within the agency. And this is the work that Gary Fielding, I hope, will be able to help enunciate within government, within the bureaucracy, because it is tricky at times to deal with the agency. We're trying to change the focus onto things that are really important to the community. I'm not saying Crown Lands is the saviour. It is part of a solution. And if you have underutilised block of land in the centre of town, which has services to it, we would be silly not to look at that capacity.
A number of questions to Minister from Lee O'Connor and several other people about really small communities. One says, it's great to hear about the small house projects, but even the smallest towns in our region need hundreds of houses. We need big thinking from the Commonwealth. Lee says, can we be assured that the government's state housing strategy won't exclude smaller towns and focus on regional centres? And, you know, how can we focus on getting developers engaged, perhaps with those smaller regional communities?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And no, little towns will never be excluded. I think there's some very sweet opportunities because they're idyllic and often very pretty, and can come with the charm and all of those aspects of country life. in terms of developers, I suppose, it's got to add up. They're interested in capacity and the ability to get a return on their investments. And if that can be shown, there is no reason why they wouldn't be interested. And I also take up that challenge, and I know John Barilaro and I are very interested and keen to get a more seamless planning pathway. Let me give you an example. In one of those towns, bigger towns I mentioned earlier, we've done an expression of interest to and put it out publicly, explained it to the community, and in an area where there is a lot of social housing. The Sydney bureaucrats could not believe there wasn't one complaint from them via the media, from tenants, from anyone in the community upset that we might be looking at changing the makeup of that estate. Not one complaint, because country people are pretty sensible. We know that we need more housing. It's on everybody's lips. So we're going through this pathway without criticism, but with support from the community. And the point I make here, we can get a lot more done in the country because there are a lot of people on board, need it and want it. You try and do anything in Sydney, it's you become almost torn, you're round and round in circles. But in the country, we have this energy and this desire to do it. And we all know what a turnaround it is on many of what our communities have been facing. It is the only positive out of COVID, and the fact that it's rained and the rivers and the dams are all full. But there is a real sense of optimism and energy, and we've got to tap into it, and we've got to have the people on the ground. And Gary and my advisory council, Gary Fielding from the task force, as well as our Department of Regional Development, now located in the regions, is going to very much help on that pathway.
Minister, just a couple more quick questions for you. And we do now have the link to the Property Index site, so that's on the question board that we're all operating. But if you're searching for it yourself, nsw.gov.au Property Index, we'll find it for you. A question saying, do you have any advice about opportunities to engage private investment in new housing in more remote areas? Many new builds face loss of capital over 5 years. We've also got questions about the shortage of materials, construction workforce, DA delays, the solutions for expediting housing in the near future.
Okay, I heard Mark Coulton mention having to have the houses to North Bourke delivered up there. I was in Moree the other day, and we were building some housing there, and it was because, Moree's not remote, but they were specially designed homes, so they were indestructible. I think the spend was, $500,000 a house. That wasn't including the land. Whereas I know my agency bought some properties, 22 villas within this region recently, which they now usually do. They usually like to control the build, but the build, it was $250,000 a unit. So that gives you an idea of the length and breadth of investments required. And ironically, we have a real problem with timber and timber supply. We're hearing that. Look, I can't solve that. No, I haven't got those solutions myself. I know there are good people working towards it. But it is important to understand our challenges so we can address them as best as we can. But I do know that there is a lot of pressure on us to close the timber industry down, for example, on the mid-north coast and north coast of New South Wales, which grows the best hardwood in the world. And the irony of that pressure on a sustainable, beautiful, ecologically, wonderful product to build homes with, that improves carbon, carbon output, is a real challenge for us. But we'll work through those. But I don't have a solution for everything that's just been raised there. But we are aware of the challenges and want to make things better.
Well, just very, very quickly, Minister, there's a question saying ROIs. It's really hard to see return on investment in small towns. What about some incentives to help? And another question saying, what about peppercorn rents for housing associations?
Community housing associations, peppercorn rents. I mean, at the end of the day, we need to be able to fund, keep the maintenance, fund, you know, rent also pays for maintenance, it also pays for rates, it also pays for reinvestment in new properties. So I think we have to be, you know, compassionate, at the same time practical about what we need to be able to do to look after our investments and grow those investments. Yeah, I'd love to be Santa Claus and peppercorn rents, but that's not viable, and it's not good for the long-term future of the sector.
Minister, I'll let you go. You've opened up Pandora's box. There are no less than, I think, 16 or 17 questions there. I've tried to amalgamate most of those as best I can, and apologies to those whose comments I didn't get to, but thank you very much indeed for your time.
But if you want to send those questions, if they're online and you want to send them on to the office, we'll do our best. It'd be good to hear what they are so that we can get a flavour of the conversations. But I leave you today thanking you for bringing everyone together, but also knowing, you know, the solution's not in any one person's hands, it's in all of our hands, and we've got to work together.
Thank you so much, Minister, and goodbye. And yeah, it's a vigorous conversation already. A comment from Edwina Hayes on the stream that says the return on investment on any build in remote areas needs incentives to engage private equity. Incentives include appealing to social or ethical investment, for example, the super funds. I think that goes back to this conversation we've already begun about flexible solutions that engage local providers. Well, it's time to formally begin our first session, and that's on the current state of play. A reminder again that you can use the screen to your right to type questions and get involved in the discussion. We're going to start in this first session by describing what's happening right here and now on the ground regarding inland housing, some of the factors that make up this knotty problem with all its layers of complexity. You're going to hear from 4 speakers, and a reminder that we will have time at the end for questions. We've allocated about 10 minutes at the end of this session, so please enter those into the question box and they'll come straight to me. You don't need to wait to ask those questions, put them in right now. Our keynote comes from Peta Gilhome from Domain, who opens up the first session. Peta's a regional account manager with a huge passion for regional New South Wales and real estate. She's focused on how relationships and connections encourage collaboration in the regional real estate industry. And her keynote this morning is entitled A Commercial Eye. Welcome, Peta.
Thanks so much, Genevieve. Just waiting for the video to pop over and share my presentation with you all. Well, what an exciting time to be coming together to discuss the growth of our regions. My name is Peta Gilhome. My pronouns are she and hers. I'm so delighted to be speaking to you today from my home in Wagga Wagga on Wiradjuri country. I pay my respects to Aunty Cheryl Penrith and thank her for her welcome to country this morning. I extend that welcome and that respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'd particularly like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us in this summit today. I'm sure, as many of you know, the RAI commissioned a study late last year which showed 1 in 5 city residents were looking to move to a regional area, 50% of those wanting to do so in the next 12 months. I'm here today to share some insights into how Domain is seeing this play out in the property market. At Domain, our purpose is to inspire confidence in all life's property decisions. We're home to 8.7 million Australian property seekers, and that gives us a wealth of data on property supply and demand and where and what people are looking for and how this changes over time. I've worked for Domain for almost 8 years, and I'm fiercely passionate about our regional areas and advocating for their importance within Domain. I believe we have a significant part to play in the decentralisation of the Australian population through advocacy, access and thought leadership. Our unique data insights allow us to see emerging trends in population movement, and our deeper data sets reveal what people are doing when they're making a move, what they're looking for. All of this, I believe, can really help us have well-informed regional planning. What we've seen in recent years is a significant growth in the appetite for rural and regional living. As many here know, the exodus from our metropolitan cities isn't new, with net migration loss from metro areas to our regions starting in around 2015. However, as we all know, COVID has accelerated it dramatically, and that's had some significant impacts across our regional markets. Today, I'm going to look through some of the broader market insights from Domain's most recent market update. Bear with me on this. While I will talk about our capital cities, it's important that we understand the wider context of the property market. It gives context to what we're seeing in regional areas. I've also prepared 2 case studies, one for Wagga, which looks at the market trends across the local government area, and one for Dubbo Orana, looking at trends across a wider regional footprint. So let's get started. Dr. Nicola Powell is our Chief of Research and Economics. She stated earlier this week, as I'm sure many of you will agree, that COVID has created the greatest social and economic changes in our country since World War II, and it's going to absolutely leave a legacy. What we're seeing nationally is strong sales volumes and demand for property continuing to drive median prices strongly upwards. With more people spending more time at home, our nation's property obsession seems only to have grown stronger. Every single capital city has recorded growth in their median price over the quarter and also over the year. The strongest performer was Canberra at just under 30% growth over the quarter, year on year, and 10% over the quarter. Key takeouts from this report were that Sydney's house price grew by an astounding $1,200 a day over that June quarter. Melbourne's price saw an increase of $142,000 or 16.2% of its property value. For the first time, we've got 3 capital cities, Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra, with median house prices over $1 million, and Brisbane saw price growth of $11,000 a month. For the last 2 quarters, metro price growth has outpaced the regions, but this hasn't been the case always over the last 3 years. And as you can see, we've had several quarters where the growth in regions has outstripped metro. Regional markets have seen a healthy growth of 10.6% over the last quarter. What we're seeing is particularly strong price growth in regional centres or regional areas with unaffordable capital city prices. Notably, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia, where regional medians are less than half of their respective state capitals. The ABS internal migration data shows some clear patterns in the age groups of those moving to regional areas. Notably, it's people in their prime, 24 to 64-year-olds, making the vast majority of those sea and tree changes. This speaks to the destigmatisation and growing acceptance of dispersed workplaces. It seems clear that millennials have worked out there's a better model of keeping their city job and moving regional, and this has had an impact across our working age groups. We're also seeing lots of early adopter companies moving to a dispersed workplace where they're not requiring people to be in the offices regularly. Our data is pointing to this move to the regions being a sustained trend, not a flash in the pan reaction to COVID. Primarily, this belief is driven by the fact that this movement started prior to COVID, and that we're seeing people buy in regional areas, not just rent. There is a wider movement in the Australian workforce to those dispersed workplaces, and less reliance being on a central metropolitan office, giving people more freedom of choice in where they live. We can also see in our search trends that it's our larger, well-resourced regional centres that are attracting the most attention from property seekers. While places like Byron Bay may hold a certain popular appeal, we're seeing towns like Port Macquarie, Orange and Wagga outrank it by miles when it comes to property seeking audience. In fact, Port Macquarie has been ranked in the top 20 most searched suburbs or towns nationally on Domain for the last couple of years. In terms of New South Wales, Port Macquarie is sitting at our number 9 most searched suburb when we include our Sydney suburbs. Orange is currently ranked at 13 and Wagga at 21. So it gives a flavour of just how popular our regional centres are. I would like to draw your attention to something that I find really interesting and actually quite delightful about this data, and I'm sure many of you will, and that is that 6 out of 10 of the most searched areas for people to buy in regional New South Wales are inland centres, and so are half of the rental towns. It dispels the myth that it's all about sea change. One of the best ways to understand what people are specifically looking for are word clouds. These clouds show us what people are looking for by words in terms of ranking them by size. So the larger the word, the more commonly we're seeing it searched. As you can see, there are some common trends both across New South Wales and the national word clouds, and they give a flavour for what people are really wanting. Once again, it's nice to see that river in New South Wales outranks beach. And it comes as no surprise that we're seeing words like granny flat and studies ranking high. But planning for our regions needs local data. So let's have a look at a couple of case studies. Starting off with Wagga. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Wagga, but for those who aren't, Wagga is an inland city with a population of over 65,000 people. We're located equidistant from Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide in Western New South Wales. Wagga is the largest city in the Riverina and it's home to a diverse economy with larger employment sectors in ag, health and defence. Trends we're seeing in Wagga are common across our regional property markets, both coastal and inland in New South Wales and Victoria. They give a greater insight into what's driving the local conversation around lack of available housing, and they give, I guess, a solid perspective to the conversation. So let's kick off with the rental market. Wagga has seen strong growth in rental prices, with the current median weekly rental asking price sitting at $380 a week. We've seen strong growth over the last year and also over the last 5 years. In line with this growth, we've seen increasing demand push down the total number of rental properties available for lease each month. We've seen a 30% decline on the average number of total rental properties available for lease each month this year when we compare to the same month in 2020. A trend we've seen growing for a number of years, as you can see, and it's having a cumulative effect. To compound this, we've seen a dramatic rise in the number of inquiries per rental property, with a 152% jump in January this year. Once again, off the back of several years of this figure trending upwards consistently, particularly as you can see over the last 12 months. This demand has led to a great deal of stress for tenants seeking accommodation and for agents and property managers trying to place everyone looking for somewhere to live. Out-of-area tenants account for 25% of the inquiry we're seeing, with strong local demand from within the 2650 postcode. But you can also see the out-of-area regions that we're seeing generate this out-of-area inquiry. When we're looking at out-of-area inquiry in this context, we're looking at anyone from outside the local postcode. So we do see a large amount of Riverina out-of-area inquiry into Wagga, but also a lot from the Sydney area. So Macarthur, Camden, Parramatta, eastern suburbs, as you can see. Moving on to sales. Wagga's median house price now sits at $415,000. It's up 3.8% year on year. However, this doesn't really feel like it reflects the heat that we're feeling on the ground. And agents are telling me that some individual suburbs are up 30% this quarter. Interestingly, they're feeling that our newer suburbs, the price growth is largely driven by young local homeowners taking advantage of low interest rates. The total number of properties for sale has declined on average 42% in comparison with the same months last year. Off the back of this total stock decline last year, once again, this is creating a cumulative effect that's increasing competition per listing, pushing buyers to offer more quickly and more frequently above asking price to secure their listings or their new homes. Interestingly, new stock to market is relatively consistent with previous years. As we can see, it's easier to gauge this across a 3-year trend. And it indicates that it's the total stock volume that's available that's really creating the pressure in our regional markets. We're seeing the inquiry rate once again increase significantly, with growth of between 150 and 300% each month this year in comparison to the same month last year, when we look at the inquiry per listing on properties for sale in Wagga. Out-of-area buyer activity is strong at 36%, with the eastern suburbs, Central Coast and Western Sydney being strong sources of buyers outside the Riverina. And back to our word cloud. I find it really interesting when we compare our word clouds for buy and rent in Wagga and our regional centres. As you can see, what people are looking for when they're purchasing is often a little bit different to what they're looking for when they're renting. And these word clouds can give us an indication of how we can best plan for future growth. So let's move on to Dubbo and Orana, a hugely diverse set of property markets in the central northwestern districts of New South Wales. Its population sits at 122,000. And once again, we're going to kick off with the rental market. So just bearing in mind when looking at this stat, this median is looking at the Dubbo region, so not that full Dubbo Orana. But what we're seeing in Dubbo is a $385 median weekly rental asking price. We've also seen strong growth in those rental prices over the last quarter and the last 5 years. Once again, we can see the cumulative stock decline over the last 2 years in particular, with vacancies starting at a 5-year high in February, March of 2020, with just over 700 properties available for rent, then dropping to a record low of June, July this year at just under 350. Just a quick note on this, we're still waiting for the rest of the vacant properties to come on to site over the August month. So please don't be too shocked by that significant drop in August. It just hasn't collated all of the data for this month as yet. But on average, we've seen 42% fewer rental properties available for lease each month this year in comparison to 2020 in the Dubbo Orana region. Once again, we've seen record inquiry building dramatically from June 2020 in particular. Just under 25% of the inquiry is coming from out-of-area tenants, with Western Sydney, the Mid-North Coast and New England making up the top 3 out-of-area locations when we take out those in the Central West, who we would consider to be, I guess, in area if we're looking at that wider Dubbo Orana footprint. Moving on to the sales data. Dubbo's regional median house price is currently sitting at $400,000. Once again, noting that this is for the Dubbo statistical local area, not the full Dubbo Orana area. But it's quite reflective of the growth we've seen across the wider region. Once again, we can see the cumulative effect of total stock decline on the market. Although it's been relatively stable for the 3 years prior to 2020, and the decline in 2020 is less dramatic, excuse me, than some regions, where you'll find there would be some individual markets within the Orana that were driving this decline and feeling the impacts more acutely than others. New properties to the market, once again, is relatively consistent. And once again, much easier to see across the 3-year trend. The reality is price growth is making it really appealing for many vendors to list their properties. We're also seeing a trend of upsizing with lower interest rates and more time at home. There's also a relative feeling of job security and opportunity as we see more professional jobs decoupled from their metropolitan hubs. And that's certainly driving people's security in investing in larger properties and larger family homes across our regional centres. Once again, inquiry clearly shows the demand, with a growth of between 95 and almost 230% of the number of inquiries per property every month this year in comparison to the same month in 2020. It's a trend that's been clearly on the rise since April last year. Dubbo and Orana are seeing an astoundingly strong out-of-area buyer inquiry. Keep in mind, as this is such a large footprint and we're looking here at anyone out of a postcode being an out-of-area inquiry, it is going to appear larger than when we look at a single postcode jurisdiction. But, you know, we can also see here that there are a lot of interest out of Western Sydney, Sydney's lower North Shore and eastern suburbs. And that would be driving these prices and this demand that we're seeing as well. Once again, back to those word clouds and the difference between sale and rent, key search terms across the Dubbo Orana region. Once again, we're seeing those key terms like study and storage and shed being very popular. So in wrapping up, I really believe that these local data sets are the key to understanding the nuances and trends in our local housing markets, to better forecast and plan, but also to really understand what's going on beyond the colloquial assumptions which we can get skewed with when just relying on people recounting their individual experiences. What we've seen across almost every regional footprint without exception in New South Wales and Victoria, and the data we've looked at today is a pretty true reflection of most areas, is increased demand pushing total stock down and prices up. While there is still a good flow of new stock to market, it's the cumulative effect of demand and the total stock numbers declining as older stock moves off market that's really driving the heat in these regional property markets. As always in these circumstances, it will be the most vulnerable in our communities who are most susceptible to the negative impacts of these changes, as they're outbid and out-negotiated. But we absolutely can't lose sight of that. But it also provides an extremely exciting opportunity for key stakeholders across government and non-government organisations to use the influx of capital and the growth in population to justify, inspire and fund smart future planning. People are seeking more from where they live, and they're seeking it in our regional towns. There's significant opportunity to use smart design, designing principles across our towns and regions as we grow our villages and cities into highly livable communities. I'd encourage us to destigmatise well-planned, well-designed and well-built high to medium density living close to our regional CBDs. It will provide more diversified housing options for our younger and older citizens with lower costs of entry and lower maintenance. We're absolutely seeing the demand for it, and it will be a significant step in taking pressure off public housing. Let's encourage people to get out of their cars and get them walking and biking with active travel plans to reduce road congestion and create opportunity for conversation amongst residents. We know people want to escape the commute in the cities, so let's not follow the design pitfalls of larger cities into endless urban sprawl. Let's create engaging public spaces and reasons for people to spontaneously congregate, to create communities and connect, using mixed development precincts within our suburbs to allow for coffee shops and general stores as community meeting places. Let's look at innovative developments like rent to buy. We're starting to see these pop up in Sydney and Melbourne. We know these things create communities, increase wellbeing, and also increase opportunity for people to get onto the property ladder. They increase the appeal of our suburbs and towns in our regional centres. And, so many councils are doing a brilliant job of integrating these principles into their strategic development plans now. Because while the challenges of growth are great, the opportunities they bring to reshape and enhance our regional communities are huge. Now more than ever, we have a wealth of data to help guide the way. So let's dream big, because everything in our data shows us we're on the cusp of an incredible renaissance of regional Australia. If you'd like to keep up to date with what we're seeing in the Riverina and regional property trends, please find me on LinkedIn and pop through a connection request. We're just in the infancy at Domain of exploring how we can create better access to these relevant localised data sets. So I'd be really interested to hear from you if you can see an application for your organisation so we can start to map out what that might look like. I just want to close by thanking RDA, Riverina and Orana for creating a space for such an important discussion. We're privileged to have a dedicated organisation like RDA to catalyse and connect us in these discussions. And I'm so looking forward to hearing the many and diverse perspectives that today will bring. Thanks so much.
And thank you so much, Peta. I've got lots of very positive responses from people on your presentation, including people saying, absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. And quite a few requests about that property market analysis for our LGAs. We might deal with that a little further in the question section at the end of this session. There are also some questions about mining and that influence it might have on Dubbo. But look, before we go to our next speaker, the collaboration with the real estate industry and all property stakeholders is clearly really critical to solving the inland housing issues we're facing. So I would like to now draw your attention to one of our major sponsors for the summit today, and that's the Housing Industry Association. They're the official body of Australia's home building industry, and there's a brief presentation from them now.
In 1945, we came together to house a growing country, to build with integrity and establish our nation's foundations. Since then, HIA members have helped millions of Australians build their dream home, their place of self, security and belonging. Today, we're Australia's largest residential building organisation, working to build the best home for every Australian, supporting our members and giving customers someone to trust. We give our industry a united voice so our members can focus on building better homes. We keep members informed and set them superior standards so they always build with integrity. We do all this to give Australians a foundation they can depend on today and tomorrow. It's not just why we began, it's why we'll exist long into the future. HIA, you're in good hands.
And thanks to the HIA and to our many sponsors, without whom, of course, none of this is possible. Our next speaker is Neil Barber from the Australian Red Cross. Neil manages the Australian Red Cross migration support programs in southwestern New South Wales, including the large residential accommodation program for humanitarian settlement in Albury and Wagga. And it's a significant bit of juggling of both assets and people. And sometimes those people, of course, are in considerable stress. Neil's worked in this area for more than 25 years, and he brings a wealth of experience with him. He speaks to us this morning about migrant housing needs. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you, Genevieve. Good morning, everyone. It's still morning. I'll just start my presentation and we'll go from there. So, yeah. So you can see that, and the family in this picture is not an unusual feature of humanitarian settlement in regional New South Wales, and New South Wales has one of the largest regional humanitarian settlement programs in Australia. But when we talk about migration, there are many components to that. Particularly, we talk about skilled migration, which predominantly is not an area that Red Cross is involved in, but we also are increasingly looking at that broader experience of how migrants of all pathways and backgrounds fit into their experience of settling in regional Australia and what that would look like. From a Red Cross perspective, we're a humanitarian agency. Our primary mission is to uphold the dignity of individuals and families and communities to ensure their safety in relocating to places of safety as refugees or asylum seekers, and to ensure their interests and their integration into their hosting or welcoming community is as smooth as possible. Red Cross acknowledges and pays our respects to the elders of the Wiradjuri Nation, and we acknowledge that their enduring and never-ceded custodianship of country requires us to exercise the responsibility to act with cultural humility and responsibility for the land and the people. In saying that, welcome to Australia. Yama is the abbreviated Wiradjuri terminology for welcome. In Burmese, it's Minga Labu. In Punjabi, it's Tusi Kadanji. In Farsi, it's Salam Darud. In Swahili, it's Hu Jomba. In Kamanji, it's Rajba. And in Nepali, it's Namaste. These are just some of the languages and that are spoken already in Western inland New South Wales, from Albury through to Wagga, out to Griffith, through the central west, and particularly emerging in particular around Tamworth and Armidale as well. These are people who come to Australia in a lot of different ways. And I mentioned earlier that while our work is primarily with humanitarian migration, which is perhaps the smallest category of migration into Australia, we also often work with people who are in that 1.7 million prior to COVID who came to Australia as temporary migrants, either on temporary or short-term working visas, tourism visas, student visas, or family visas. Or we have those who come as skilled and family migrants on permanent residency visas. Obviously, migration has largely disappeared in the last 18 months as a significant impact. There is still a small amount of movement, and in point of fact, up until September 2020, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Scanlon Foundation, there was about a 900 positive net increase in migration into Australia during that first epoch of COVID. So we actually are a migration nation in lots of different ways. George McGlanus, the journalist, would probably say to us that we need to be really aware that in colonial, post-colonial Australian history, it is at the points at which we've been most open to migration that we've experienced our greatest growth. And it certainly is reflected throughout history that they're the key times in which we've seen that expansion, not only of the Australian population, but particularly of regional industry and regional growth. And I guess that's one of the things that we are seeing emerge increasingly in regional Australia at the moment, and particularly in regional New South Wales, is that migrants are the key drivers of population growth into the regions. So when we look a little more deeply into those sorts of figures, of those 18,000 humanitarian visas, by and large, all those 1.7 million temporary migrants, or the 140-odd thousand skilled migrants, nearly all of those people initially arrive into one of our major cities. Sorry, I've just, there we go. Particularly Sydney and Melbourne. And from there, then move out, not necessarily too far from those major cities. Brisbane and Adelaide and Perth, to some extent, also provide that initial location experience. What we see, though, is that, and it's one of the reasons why I think in the Riverina and the Murray regions we do see a lot of migration, is not just the historical context, which is important of migration in this area, but also that map that shows how central this region is to the interaction between the communities that do settle in those other major cities. So that as they move through and visit each other, then obviously the areas that are in between are jumping off points, if you like, where people sort of look and see whether this is actually maybe a better place or a better opportunity to settle. What we know is that generally speaking, a lot of regional migration currently occurs in what we would call the temporary category. Those people who are on short-term visas, who are either coming in on a very broad experience of traveling, or are here specifically to work for a specific purpose. The thing that we find is that they're often then coming into the regions on a almost transitional basis as they move through to other locations, looking for work or fulfilling certain visa requirements that they might have to work in a regional area, particularly if they're looking for a visa extension, or that has been the trend of late. We know that for those migrants who do move to the regions more permanently, one of the attractions that they see is that when they come to communities where there are existing communities of diversity. So if they become aware that Albury or Wagga or Tamworth, for example, or Shepparton or Toowoomba are places where they see that diversity in the street, then they're also going to be the places where they can see opportunities for them to also establish themselves. I often say in meetings around regional migration that one of the things is that regional migration has migration into the regions has also been one of the key sustainability factors for regional communities. We often hear regions talk about the youth drain as young people go away to the cities to study, but it's always been met by, I guess, the influx of migrants and their families coming into the regions to provide services. And that in fact, in point of time, some of those children or young people from those families then move away to the city and another wave of migrants come through and take up that challenge. I guess, particularly in the humanitarian sector, but also in some of those other areas, that we have seen in the last 10 years, a particular concentration of migration into Western Sydney and northwestern Melbourne and southeastern Melbourne that hasn't generated that wider movement out over time. And it has placed significant strain upon the infrastructure of the cities and created particular challenges. Not surprisingly then, since 2018, the federal government has identified that with less than 20% of incoming migrants settling in regional Australia, that they've adopted policy principles to work toward a closer to 50% migration settlement in the regions. Unfortunately, that's been obviously interrupted by COVID. So when I talk about settlement, what am I talking about? I'm talking about usually two concepts. One is primary settlement, which is the people who arrive into a location and establish themselves there as a preferred long-term place to be. and secondary settlement, which refers to migrants who move on from their primary settlement to another location. Most humanitarian migrants come in under a primary settlement scheme program. And that means that they depart their point of origin, which might be Nairobi in Kenya, Amman in Jordan, Kuala Lumpur, or Bogota in South America, and they arrive into their new hometown in Australia, Albury, Wagga, Toowoomba, Shepparton. You can imagine the shift of, apart from a short exchange in a Sydney or Melbourne or Perth airport onto a regional flight, the experience of getting on a plane in another environment, in another country, and arriving into regional Australia as your new hometown, your new place to be. For most migrants, their first reaction to that, humanitarian migrants anyway, is that they'll talk about feeling safe for the first time. Whether they have come largely from their country of origin, or whether they have for many years been living in refugee camps, it's the sense that they finally have arrived at a place where they do not have to fear that in the next moment they will have to move on and leave everything that they have in their possession, and maybe even some of their other family members behind. For others, it also means that they're actually now in a place where they can start consider reconnecting or trying to reach out to find those other family members, which is another important factor in this migration journey. Ultimately, settlement requires housing. And it's really interesting that the most consistent pre-arrival questions that refugees ask in their cultural orientation before they leave to come to Australia is about housing. What's it like? How much is it? How big is it? How far is it from the shops or the markets or whatever? But housing, they may have questions about health if they have health needs. They may have questions about education or schooling if they have children. But nearly, well, in point of fact, in the last survey that was undertaken by the providers of that information, every single applicant or traveller in every single post or port of origin around the world coming to Australia, from South America through Southeast Asia, Central Asia and Africa, all asked about housing. It's not that they necessarily have a particular sense of what housing should be, but it is something that is of great concern. And I guess if you've lived either within a partially destroyed home in a city that's been under attack, or in the middle of a conflict zone, or whether you've been living in a prefabricated shanty type housing arrangement in a refugee camp for 10, 15 years, or even more in some cases, then you can understand why housing is so significant to this group. Broadly speaking, refugees are not eligible for public or social housing programs until they've been resident for at least 2 years. And even then, they go to the waiting lists that we know exist in that space. So for their initial settlement journey, they're assisted to secure private rental accommodation for up to 2 years. But their ultimate aspiration is nearly universally to have home ownership. For skilled and family migrants to move to the regions, that's often associated with the fact that they have pre-secured employment, or that they have family or community links to other migrants who have preceded them. And they often emerge initially into a house sharing arrangement before they enter the private rental market. And similarly, they also aspire to home ownership. When we look at the secondary settlement pattern though, what we see is that most secondary settlement is associated with an early relocation to a community with extended family or associations. What we've seen in the last few years is that often that's been intercity, so between Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane. But sometimes, and particularly what's really interesting in this space is for primary settlement in regional areas, there is relatively little onward movement, and that's been a significant change in the migration pattern. In some places, often people would arrive, spend their initial 6 months establishing themselves, and then decide that they would rather be in a major city, or that it would be easier to relocate to a major city. We're not seeing that so much in the last 5 years, that they're much more likely to stay. And in fact, Wagga and Albury have some of the highest levels of settlement continuity of all the humanitarian settlement locations in Australia. Historically, secondary settlement has not had a lot of structure of support. If people choose to move, then they usually find themselves very much at their own device or responsible for their own arrangements. But the impact of that heavy primary settlement post the Syrian conflict, or arising out of the Syrian conflict, into Sydney and Melbourne has led to a rethinking of this as a formal strategy at state and federal level. And so we've had a policy shift in that thinking. It's been largely employment driven. However, it also acknowledges that stress upon infrastructure, but also from that has realised that if city infrastructure is being impacted by migration, then how will regional settlement communities also meet that challenge? And there's therefore a lot of discussion going on, not only around housing and employment, but also around healthcare, transport, and education and schooling, and language development. There is also a recognition that temporary migration leads to secondary settlement for insecure humanitarian migrants. These are people who are on bridging visas and things like uncertain visa pathways, or for those who come in as specific rural workforce migrants. And there's particular challenges for that group also in housing around what might be called regulated or unregulated accommodation. If we look at the key challenges that migration and housing face, access is one. Housing in Australia has its own particular laws and processes that, while they're not unique probably to most Western Anglophonic countries, they're not always easy to understand if you come from a very different cultural and judicial and legal system. Temporary migrants in particular are vulnerable, as I said, to unregulated housing arrangements and the associated exploitation with that. And what I'm talking about there is the situation of people being brought in to work on farms, often under labour contracting arrangements, and being required, often as part of that arrangement, quite often without any enforcement capacity, to reside on the farm in a provided place. And that might well be something like 18 to 20 workers living in a 3-bedroom weatherboard farmhouse that's fairly dilapidated. Those sort of situations are not uncommon in regional New South Wales, and they're increasingly being associated with issues of exploitation. But they're also unregulated because they are fundamentally private arrangements that occur in that space between the labour hire contractors and the property owners. Affordability. Most humanitarian migrants begin on fixed incomes through Centrelink, and they have a significant challenge gaining a foothold in employment. It's one of the other reasons why we are looking particularly to encourage and develop the employment opportunities for migrants in regional areas. That temporary migrants will be usually extremely limited in the housing they can afford because they often don't even have access to fixed incomes, and they are reliant upon casual wages. And if they're working in the agricultural sector, then often external factors will impact upon their worker availability. And skilled migrants may actually come with some unrealistic expectations about what the cost of housing in Australia really is. The other feature that we find from most migrants is that they find the notion of time-limited tenancies managed by intermediaries such as real estate agents, community housing organisations, or even now increasingly organisations like Red Cross as a humanitarian service provider, a bit of a challenge, because in the past it's always been a direct relationship if you're renting with your landlord, and it's often been on an enduring and ongoing basis, often sometimes over generations. I think the other feature is that they also are looking for homes or home environments that accommodate a multi-generational living arrangement and can allow the integration of sub-family units that live together in close or proximity. So if we put that into a regional context, these are, I guess, some of the challenges. That we need a supply or access to a supply that's often been assumed by, I would say, government to be relatively unrestricted and affordable in regional areas. And we've certainly seen, as our last presenter made very clear, that significant change that's occurred there. That the construction timeline of new housing is so much longer in cities that it's very hard to see how we improve the access to available housing, but particularly for regional families or regional locations where we are looking to settle large families, there's particular challenges in that space. That the investment for increasing supply may need different approach to marketing. One of the things that we have looked at and spoken with in Sydney and Melbourne is with communities of migrants who are established and maybe have had long careers and are coming up to retirement, about how they would like to assist their communities by perhaps investing in regional housing opportunities. And cultural engagement is critical. Using interpreters, and interpreting is now a free access service through the Commonwealth TIS telephone interpreting service for real estate agents, to actually build those understandings of key concepts and relationships that helps a family establish in a community. Affordability, I think there is a challenge there in that perception about why our tenancy models are so time limited, and whether there is a space for longer term and planned or progressive rents or rental trade-offs that might occur over time. Subsidisation by employers or skilled migrants or government seems unlikely without some form of incentivisation, such as perhaps social impact bonds or investment. And it was interesting to hear Minister Pavey talk to some extent about those opportunities as a key factor. And I think there's also that we will see increasing scrutiny of irregular or unregulated housing for temporary visa holders, particularly around the three critical things that we've learned through COVID. Is it safe? Is it healthy? And is it fair? Finally, adaptability. Can prefabrication provide solutions for larger family groups and meet the rapid deployment requirements if migration increases significantly, as we expect it to do, once we get to that threshold of vaccination with COVID and the reopening of borders? Can we rethink our culture of housing to meet newcomers with bespoke housing solutions that meet their needs? What would our planners say to propositions for things like compound housing on large rural blocks on the fringes of our regional cities? How does employment and housing fit together for the mutual benefit of the regions and all their communities? There is no one answer to any of this, and we all know that. But I think that the really significant key is to understand that migration will always be a driver of demand for both rental initially, but also potentially for the purchase of housing. But I think we also need to see the opportunities there for it to be a source or an investment point for the creation of new housing options in regional communities. The other thing I will just briefly touch on is the opportunity for smaller communities to be particularly involved in migration settlement. And we're doing a lot of work at the moment with places like Temora, Leeton, Walla Walla, and the Greater Hume Shire around Albury, Corowa as well, about how those smaller communities that are often been excluded from refugee or humanitarian settlement in the past, and migration settlement broadly, can actually participate in actually being part of a regional solution to settlement. And I think in that context, it's really interesting to note the appeal of the larger blocks, home blocks in country towns that allow for these families to actually think about how they could actually have the lifestyle or the livelihood that they're actually seeking for them and their families. Because we currently have in some places in Western Sydney and northwestern Melbourne and places like that, households of 10 to 15 living in 3-bedroom units in high-rise compartments. I recently attended a look-see visit by the Assyrian community in Western Sydney to Walla Walla. It was a couple of years ago, actually, not recent. But one of the things that they were blown away with was the sense of being able to see their children running around in the street and riding a bike to the local school and things like that as really appealing and really a key to what they wanted to achieve for their families. Their biggest challenge, and in a place like Walla it's understandable, is the availability of affordable housing. How do we go about creating those opportunities in those really small country towns for people to consider that as a place where they can be? Thank you for your time. I'm be happy to listen to your questions and your thoughts as we come back to the end, but my contact details are there and they'll be available to you if you want to talk further about this at another stage.
Many thanks, Neil. Look, thank you very much indeed. And we certainly are getting a number of questions in through the Slido. I'll go to those when we finish the session at around about 10:25 or so. Our next speaker today is Julie Briggs, the principal of JB MS Consulting. She's worked with business and government for over 25 years, and since 1997 that's included CEO services for the Riverina Eastern Regional Organisation of Councils, identifying, initiating and implementing projects that increase the efficiency and the effectiveness of local governments through collaboration. There again, that keyword, I think we've heard from everyone today about the need for government and the private sector to collaborate to solve these problems. Julie's been working with government and industry stakeholders on the development of a regional housing strategy for Eastern Riverina, and today she speaks to us about a local approach to housing analysis. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you very much. I too am speaking from Wagga Wagga. There seems to be a bit of a theme happening, I guess, with that. I'd like to acknowledge that standing on Wiradjuri country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This project that I'm talking about today is a joint project between the Riverina Eastern Regional Organisation of Councils and the Riverina Joint Organisation. It's our region covers an area of 33,000 square kilometres and 115,000 people. And we've brought Riverina REROC and the Riverina JO have 8 LGAs that are members. In December last year, it was becoming pretty clear that we had a serious housing shortage occurring in our region. I was going to meeting after meeting where it was coming up as an issue. And I guess so, you know, at the catalyst for really this project is around, I say no housing stock, but minimal housing stock, although, you know, in a town like Bland, there is not a house, in a West Wyalong, which is in Blandshire, there is not a house to rent there. We only had, when we started this project, there were no houses for rent in Lockhart, and at the moment there's one. You know, there was nothing to rent in Gundagai, and at the moment there's 4. And in Greater Hume Shire, which takes in Culcan and Holbrook, there are currently 2 houses for rent. So, so we can't grow our businesses if there's nowhere for our staff to live. And as previous speakers have mentioned, there is billions of dollars in infrastructure projects about to commence in this region, or will commence over the next few years, bringing hundreds of workers who all need to be housed. And we see that the lack of housing is acting as a bit of a handbrake on growth. When we've spoken to our councils, they believe there's sufficient land zone for residential development, but it's not being developed. And of course, this all has a big flow-on impact on the shortage of affordable housing, because in a game of supply and demand, as supply shortens, prices go up, of course. So in early this year, we decided that what we really needed to do was to look at this problem as a region, see what we could come up with as solutions. Our goals in the project really is to make sure that we have sufficient housing across a diversity of type to meet current and future demand. We need, you know, dual occupancy, multi-dwelling units. We need, you know, freestanding. So we need quite a diversity to meet the current and future demand. We want to make sure we've got a vibrant and viable housing sector that supports regional growth. And we, of course, want to capitalise on this strong infrastructure investments that are occurring in the region. They'll bring new residents and we want to hold on to them. And this is, and I think, you know, Minister Pavey was saying it earlier, we've just got this sort of perfect storm. Many of us who've been working in this economic development area for longer than we can remember, you know, have been involved in projects like Sea Change, which the RDA runs, and, you know, trying to get people to move to the regions and, you know, enjoy this fabulous lifestyle we have. And all of a sudden we've turned around, and extraordinarily suddenly it feels to most of us that everybody wants to be in the regions, and all of a sudden we can't house them all. And it's the perfect storm for us. So we have looked at this from across 3 areas. We think that there is an ecology, if you like, for how housing development works. You need land, you need developers, and you need people who want to invest in the housing that's being developed. Developers don't build housing just to hang on to it, they build it to sell it. So, and conversely, if there is no demand for housing investment, then developers won't develop and they won't be looking for land. So we sort of have a circle arrangement happening. And on top of that, all of those three things are influenced by policy, planning and finance. So what we've looked at is all of those areas in the context of our region, but also beyond. There are a number of joint organisations right across country New South Wales that are facing this problem, as we've heard today, and we have been interacting with them, as well as developers through the Housing Industry Association and community housing through Argyle, and other public housing experts to try and work out what our best approach is for the region. So from a land availability perspective, we've been looking at supply issues and release issues. And what I've tried to do here and for this presentation is just to bring out what we think is the key issues that we've identified. Around supply is land zone, having enough land zone for diversity of uses. We have a bit of a problem where we do have a lot of zone land, but some of it's not particularly attractive. And because it's not attractive, people aren't taking it up. It's, I think it was Melinda who was saying, you know, land on where there's a lot of excavation work or those kinds of things. There's issues around supply that about the cost and complexity of the zoning. The Crown land issue, a lot of the Crown land in our region is still subject to native title claims that remain unresolved, which takes Crown land out of the loop. The cost of land and sort of some kind of alternative ownership arrangements, you know, renting land, community land trusts, those kinds of things. Release issues, we have an issue here around landowners being reluctant to develop. You know, they're doing some land banking, or there's the cost associated with infill, the biodiversity offset payment scheme, the availability of finance can be a big issue in regional areas, the cost of upgrading infrastructure. And then in rural areas, councils are often the major residential land supplier or developer, and there are issues around ensuring that council has sufficient financial wherewithal to make that happen, but also councils are very aware of the fact that they're dipping into a market which private enterprise traditionally plays in, and to ensure that they're not influencing the market too much. So that's an issue that they need to come to terms with. Around residential development, some of the key things that we have talked about that influence whether developers want to come and play in our sandpit, the upfront costs and the long lead times before you get a return on your investment, access to finance for developers and investors, paperwork associated with planning and approvals. We've talked about this earlier today, the return on investment for developers is a key. Lack of investors. There has been an issue around, you know, people wanting to, not lack of investors from in terms of people wanting to own and occupy, but lack of investors in terms of people who want to purchase and then rent. Shortages, we have skill shortages, and we also have supply shortages. I think the Minister was talking this morning about the cost of timber. This is a bit of an ongoing problem, and the skill shortages is too in our region. We are finding it is blowing out the time that is taking to actually build a house now. There are some barriers to short-term temporary accommodation that are in place around planning. We would like to be able to look at developing caravan parks, old pubs and public buildings into some kind of accommodation resource, and the support needed for alternative designs like tiny houses, van homes. There are some issues around the manufactured home regulation that impact on what councils can monitor and regulate in relation to tiny houses and particularly van homes. And then in residential investment, we're looking of particular concern for us is the accuracy of population projections. And it was really interesting this morning the way Peta was talking about looking at what Domain has been doing with regard to home purchases and rental inquiries. Population projections determine whether or not people want to invest in your community. And it also influences what financial institutions do from a lending policies perspective. Are they going to be able to, are they going to be willing to loan to you if they look forward and think, there's going to be no capital growth here because the population is falling? So the two things go together. So the need to have very accurate population projections is important and that are reflective of what's happening on the ground. So for instance, an example of that is in West Wyalong or Blantyre, where the current population projection is for the Shire to lose 600 people over the next, I think about 15 years. And, but we know that the Evolution Mining there will almost double its workforce over that same period of time and has only growth in mind. And as I've said before, there are no houses to rent in West Wyalong and there are almost no houses to purchase. So there is a conflict between what the population projections say, which therefore influence lending policies in financial institutions and also therefore influence what developers do and what is actually required in West Wyalong by way of housing. In small pools of investors are difficult. We can see that the housing prices are rising, which impacts on returns on investment for people. So, you know, how much rent are you going to get? How much is the house going to cost you to buy? Those kinds of things. Risk and returns on, particularly on rentals, has come up as a bit of an issue, particularly for long-term rentals, and interesting in the context of what Neil was saying about needing much longer terms for rentals. We are getting feedback around landlords being concerned about their level of risk and exposure with longer term rentals, about when it goes wrong, the difficulty in writing the problem because tenants need to have rights, but the difficulty when something goes wrong. And what we seem to be seeing in this region is landlords taking rental properties off the long-term market and putting them on Airbnb or short-term rentals, because it means that if something goes wrong, it's the risk is much smaller. The same with public housing, renting out for sort of public housing type people who, where something goes wrong, it makes it very difficult for landlords. So risk and returns, and then models that support some kind of temporary housing. There's been a lot of talk about the number of construction workers that will be coming into our region in the short term and longer term, and we need solutions that respond to those demands. So some of the key actions that we have looked at coming up with to respond to that is, and I think they reflect the complexity of the shortage of housing issue, is a revolving infrastructure fund. A lot of feedback says that the upfront cost is, particularly putting in roads, water, electricity, sewage, those kinds of things, so enormous, and then there is that sort of lead time until sale, that a revolving infrastructure fund, which would be funded by the state, where the money comes out, perhaps goes to the council, who then makes arrangements with the developer to fund the infrastructure, which is then repaid as sales are made, would mitigate that upfront cost. The funding would be returned to the revolving infrastructure fund to be lent out again. would be something we think would work and a way of mitigating that kind of risk. Again, delaying infrastructure contributions and biodiversity offset payments. You know, in rural areas, some of the biodiversity offset payments are quite large. Again, it's an upfront payment, and perhaps, you know, the state delaying those payments or making them milestone dependent on sales might mitigate that upfront cost. We think we need to do more marketing around the value of investing in rural areas to financial institutions. A lot of the data that, say, Peta ran through today around, you know, rates of returns, those kinds of things, would influence banks to perhaps be more open to lending in rural areas. There seems to be a reluctance to do that. I think as councils, we need to be setting land supply targets to create pipelines to ensure that there is enough and sufficient land coming forward over a number of years that developers can rely on and know that they can access. We think the identification of Crown land available for permanent temporary housing, and the Minister talked about this today, but I think we need to grapple with that resource a lot more. Again, we need to resolve the native title claims against those lands if we're ever going to use it for permanent housing. But there is also, we believe, an opportunity to use it for temporary housing results, because sometimes the Crown land is set aside for a specific purpose that won't be required for a number of years, for instance, for hospital growth or something like that, and perhaps we could be using it for temporary housing. We believe we need to form more partnerships with private enterprise and community housing providers in each of the LGAs. There are opportunities now within rail coming through, a need for construction housing. People want to, those industries want to look at forming public-private partnerships. And certainly the community housing providers, you know, working with Temora or Wagga or Griffith, are doing great jobs in these kind of partnerships, and we want to be able to do more of that as well. We think that, you know, changing the business investment visa applicants to allow them to invest in regional residential development. There's two visas, investment visas that come in where the visa holders are required to invest either 2.5 million or $5 million into Australia. They are specifically excluded from providing investing in residential real estate, but maybe they should be doing it in regional areas. That would be a great thing. We perhaps need to be looking at requiring DA approvals for large-scale developments to include provision for worker housing, and then providing some kind of tax incentive for employers to provide that kind of worker housing. We're looking at doing more in shared equity arrangements, and to mitigate land banking, maybe introduce the rating on lot yield to deter land banking as well. We think that there's, as you can see from some of the things that we've come up with, and this is just some of them, we think that there is a real diversity of actions that are required at state, federal, local and regional level that we need to implement to successfully address the housing shortage right across regional New South Wales and beyond. And over the next, you know, couple of years, the Riverina Joint Organisation and REROC will be working towards implementing those. Thank you. Any questions?
No, thank you, Gillian. I'm sorry you ended a little swiftly there, and I wasn't
watching my time.
No, you've used it very well, and thank you. And look, we will leave the questions until the end of the session, but I think that's been absolutely terrific as a reinforcement again of the need that we have to juggle the local providers and both levels of government, indeed, if not indeed the Commonwealth as well. Our next and final speaker in this session is Kim Houghton from the Regional Australia Institute. He's their chief economist who manages their policy and research portfolio to ensure that the work has practical application and supports a better policy environment and more vibrant regional economies. Recently, he's played a leading role in research on population mobility in regional Australia, an analysis of regional labour markets and the impact of COVID-19 restrictions on regional economies. And as a number of people have said already this morning, it's clear that COVID-19 is going to have profound social and demographic and economic consequences as this all rolls on. Kim joins us today to speak about the regional housing outlook. Kim, good morning and welcome.
Good morning and thank you, Genevieve. Good morning, everyone. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal land and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'm really grateful for the way they've been healing this country over the last few years, at the time that I've been living in Canberra. I'm going to talk this morning, I'm going to try to draw together some of the threads that Peter and Julie and Neil have proposed to look at where we've come from and where we're going. I think Peter and Julie in particular have talked about some of the what's been going on. I want to sort of reach a little bit deeper into some of the why and what we can do about it and build on some of those findings from Julie's inquiry as well. There we go. I'm going to rush through a little bit some of these early ones because I think we've covered some of the broad picture. I think if we look nationally, regional prices have jumped 20-odd% in the year to July this year, including up 23% in regional New South Wales. So while metro markets were slower to pick up, I think the regions really didn't slump as much during the COVID restrictions last year as metro. So there's been a much quicker catch up in regions. That optimism that a number of speakers have talked about this morning with the rains coming, the tourism industry hasn't been hit quite as badly in regions as we expected. So there is a lot of optimism in regions. I think as we have seen a slight slowing in these very high monthly growth rates in terms of prices for houses and units. Of course, the big squeeze is on rentals, and I've got some summaries there about the rentals across regional Australia are very low, regional New South Wales as well, and the price of rentals has gone up quite quickly. I won't dwell on those because other people have covered those. I just wanted to show you this one. This shows the diversity. So we've talked a bit about the diversity of places. I think it's really important when we think about responses to recognise the diversity of impact on different places. Some places are showing quite different signs of what's happening and they need quite different responses. So there is a strongly sort of place-based element to this. I think the conversation so far has really focused, not unexpectedly, on some of the larger centres and their housing challenges. Different drivers though in the smaller centres, and you can see some of this coming out in some of these data. Rental price growth is the light blue line. That's been very high for places where there's very low rental vacancy rate. So the dark blue is low vacancy rental availability, and the blue line is the rate of rental price increase. And you can see that they're opposite. So where there's a very little rental availability, there's been very strong rental price growth in Griffith and Coolman in particular. Down the other end of it, in Hay and Murrumbidgee, the rental stocks are relatively still there to some degree, above that sort of 3% level, and rents to that period to April 21 didn't go up, they've actually gone down a little bit. So it does vary across regional New South Wales. Orana, similar pattern. Dubbo, Midwest and Walgett, no availability there at all. Burke showing sort of fairly strong growth rates in rental prices, and again generally coinciding with low numbers of stock of rental availability. So it's not, the pattern does vary a little bit across regional New South Wales. Coming back, staying on this rental one just for a minute longer, what we've seen here, if you look at that dark blue line is the vacancy rates, a 12-month rolling average. It really has been a fairly long-term trend down. So we've talked about this sort of squeeze at the moment. We've got a little bit more interest in living in regions. We've got I think actually it's not just that people wanting to live in regions, it's that people living in regions are not leaving. Some of the big demographic indicators, both through the official ABS stats and through our regional movers index, shows that there's actually a more significant impact on population by people choosing not to leave regions. So they're not leaving rental properties, so those properties aren't coming onto the market. They're not leaving, so they're not selling their residential properties, so those stocks coming onto the market are low. There is certainly interest in people moving from regions, from cities to regions, but in fact the quantum, the measure of that is smaller than the change in the number of people leaving regions for cities. That's been, I think, a major driver here, and you can see some of this in this chart. The vacancy rates have been dropping steadily over a number of years, but particularly over the last 18 months or so. and the listings, the number of listings has dropped quite significantly in the last 6 months. So it's not just that we have a surge in demand, we actually have that coinciding with a real lack of supply in new properties coming onto the market. Now this is for Wagga, and we see this very much the same pattern in Dubbo. Very low rental rates, low vacancy rates for about, from sort of 2016, 2017 on. Julie mentioned, wasn't that long ago for those of us working in regional development that we really, we needed growth, we needed people, we needed jobs. That's changed, I think, in the last 3 or 4 years, and these Dubbos particularly have this sort of quite strong trajectory. Vacancy rates have been very low, but again, kicked down quite sharply in the last few months, particularly as there's been more interest in moving and less availability of properties. Now, we talked a little bit about returns. So in terms of regional Australia as a whole, the value of rents over the year to April this year has gone up about 10%. Cities, of course, were hit really hard by rents because of that lack of inflow of migrants, and Neil mentioned that the cities are sort of the primary destination. So city rental growth was very, very low, actually really low, up until the last couple of months when it started to pick up again. And yields then, so the rental return on regional property has been really quite strong. And you can see on the right-hand side there, the rental yields in terms of gross terms for regional parts of all of our states have been quite good, generally quite above what's been happening in the city. So if you're an investor, the market's there, the property prices are moving, the property prices are still about half what they are in the capital cities, and those rental yields are looking pretty strong. Turning to price growth, if you look at this sort of longer term series on the left hand side, what we're seeing here is that regions and capitals, they kind of shadow each other, but generally regions have been a bit behind capitals in terms of price growth. Now, the difference, there's only been a couple of periods where regional price growth has been higher than metro, and particularly that was last year. So, as I said, I think one of the drivers for that was that regions didn't sink quite as deep into that COVID hole. So price growth came earlier and came stronger in regions throughout 2020. So that's why we've had this really tight sort of market, particularly around Christmas time, that the summer was really tight. It's kind of averaged out a bit now, so that the price growth across regions and metro has now come to be about the same sort of growth rate, which is kind of comforting in a way. What it does show too, though, is that this is not purely just a population-driven price growth, because we know that city population's growth has been really, really, really low. That lack of inflow of migrants has really taken the bottom out of our population growth in our capital cities. So the fact that we're now seeing price growth in our capital city real estate markets is not to do with population flows. And I think the same is somewhat true of regions. We've got there is some increased flow of population to regions, but this price growth is actually driven more by these really low interest rates. And I'll show you a little bit in a sec. It's this shift of people moving into the market that weren't able to buy before because the interest rates were too high. Here's the long-term interest rate pattern. You can see that really we've had low interest rates for a while, but we've had these really low interest rate for a relatively short time, and this really does coincide with this price spike. And so the variable rates have sort of hung around that sort of 3 to 4% mark over the last year or so, but our 3-year fixed ones have come down even further to around 2% over the last year or so. So what we've seen in available interest rates to home borrowers is that they've dropped to really, really quite historically low levels. And I think that's really what's driving a lot of these price increases rather than these massive population movements. So the shortages need a different kind of response. This is an interesting one for us. Part of the problem, I think, in regional markets in terms of lack of rental accommodation is lack of investors buying into those rental properties. Very interesting on Peta's slide to see in the word clouds for those two centres that she highlighted, the words tenant and investor were there in sort of one of those medium level, for me, they look like the sort of mid-sized font. So it looks like there's quite a bit of searching going on that's using those terms investor and tenant, which is a really important sign, because I think we need to have those private investors back into the market so that they can then release those properties back onto the rental market. You can see on the left-hand chart there that we've had a really, really steady decline in the activity of investors in our national housing market over the last 2 or 3 years. just kicking up in the last 6 months or so. So I think that's a positive sign. To the extent that that flows through to regions, we may see more investors coming in, buying properties, which are then going back onto the rental market as a way of easing some of that really tight squeeze at the moment. On the flip side of that, and I like the way that the chart on the right-hand side, which is first home buyers activity in the market, it's almost the reverse. We've had this steady increase in first home buyer activity in the marketplace over the last 3 or 4 years, driven by various incentives and by these steadily declining interest rates. Now that's turned, as you can see. So first home buyers are now backing out. I think as these price increases are starting to bite and that affordability starts to reduce their ability to borrow, while investors are coming back in because the price growth is there, which is attractive to them, and also they can see these rental markets are really tight and the yields are strong. So we've got a major shift in the market going on at the moment with investors dropping out, first home buyers dropping out and investors coming back in. We think about the financial drivers of the pickle that we're in. The medium-term trend was that regions' price growth was lagging metro, and that turned around. And it's unusual for regions to lead metro, but that turned around last year. The drivers were low interest rates, first-home buyers being active, and this pent-up demand. The extent to which those of us that have been able to carry through some sustainable employment, some reliable employment through the COVID problem, there's been fewer things for us to spend our money on. We've been spending more time at home. So I think there is, and I think Peta mentioned this idea about sort of trading up, seeing a lot of interest in trading up, even in our regional centres too. So that was starting to push up growth and prices as well, and that rental stocks have been declining in the long term. Are people flocking to regions? To some degree, yes. But as I said earlier on, I think for me, the most significant one in a quantitative sense is that more people are staying in regions, and that's locking up some of those rentals and some of those sales prices. And I'll show you a chart in a minute which backs up some of Peter's ones to show that the listings are at really sort of historically low levels. The staying put held new listings down at reducing supply and contributing to short-term price growth. There have been new listings have been growing through early 2021. That should ease some of the supply pressure, but we are still seeing new listings at below the long-term average. And the people staying in regions has locked in rentals. They're not leaving, which is not freeing up availability of rentals for new arrivals. Here's the listings data, and it looks similar, I think, to the ones that Peta showed earlier on, so I won't dwell on those. The little black line is 2021, and you can see on the left-hand chart, the little black line in terms of the total number of new listings all across regional Australia is right in the middle. So we haven't seen a whole lot of new listings coming on to pick up on this price growth. It's holding fairly steady. We would normally, in a more sort of mobile market, you'd see those listings going up as vendors were moving into the market to capture a good sale price. That's not really happening yet. And you can see on the right-hand side that compared with sort of long-term average, the total number of listings is actually quite low. And I think Peta told us too that the time on market is very short for a lot of these listings as well. So it really is a combination of a slight increase in interest in buying regional property, both from people outside and people inside those regions looking to trade up, coinciding with a lack of supply, which is lower than it has been in a sort of historical context. So what's coming up? I think there's signs that these high monthly growth rates of sort of 2% or more than 2% growth in regional prices per month, that seems to have peaked. They seem to have come down below 2% now, and certainly the metro regions, metro areas and regional areas are now showing about the same level of monthly growth. I think so if those listings keep coming through, that will take some of the heat. It'll bring some more supply in. Now we do have a record level of building approvals, and I've got a chart on that next, which will make a difference too. Investors are starting to return nationally. That will, in the medium term, I think, start to bring more rental properties onto the market. What are they doing in regions? We don't have good data on what investors are doing in regions. For me, that's a really critical market-related test into how our private rental markets will evolve over the next 6 to 12 months. Will depend very much on how investors are moving and playing in those regional markets. For renters, it will take time for new stock to appear, whether it's on a new build or a new purchase by an investor. We know that there are some signs of losses, properties coming off the long-term rental market and putting on short-term or holiday uses. Tomorrow, as we mentioned a number of times, they did a sort of a town-wide bed audit as a way of finding accommodation for people that they needed to both build more houses and supply services. And I know that several councils have written to their non-resident ratepayers asking them to consider putting those properties which are not occupied on the longer term rental market to sort of ease some of those short-term pressures. That's quite a nice sort of locally driven solution, I think. Here's the supply issue. Now, the supply chart, I think this is really exciting. We have a very high number of new houses approved for destruction. This is approved residential housing approvals. Big changes in the last 3 or 4 months. We can see that we've now got a sort of a new peak. And this is just for the regions. We've now got a new peak of over 51,000 houses approved construction in the year to June 2021. Now, I think Julia mentioned the supply constraints. We have labour constraints. We have some material constraints. So these won't come onto the market as quickly as they would in normal times. Normally, you'd sort of look at sort of 4 to 6 months to get these properties onto market and completed. It's going to take longer. We know that. Because of these supply constraints, but I think it's really positive news that these building approvals are really strong across regional Australia, even in regional New South Wales. You can see, you know, our real problem, I think, at the end of 2020 was building approvals were down, the stock availability was down, everything was down. So when we got this sort of a bit of an increase in interest, it really sort of tightened what was actually a tight market anyway, even further. We can see that on the right hand side, that U shape. So we bottomed out in the middle of last year in terms of building approvals. That's now kicking up nicely. It's now back to a sort of a longer term level of building approvals for regional New South Wales. So, you know, assuming that those things can get built, that labour is available and materials are available, then we'll see a bit of an improvement in the medium term. One of the things that nobody's really talked about this morning, I think, is these structural barriers that are affecting our regional markets. When we look at our regional city markets, I think, you know, we're looking at property price values around sort of perhaps 350,000 to sort of 450,000 average. I think for me, the constraints there have been around the around not planning for growth, not getting ready for growth. You know, we generally our population projections have lowballed growth in our regional centres, and that's not been played out. There's been a lot of disagreement amongst those about those population projections over many decades across regional parts of every state. And I think we need to start to build into those population projections a growth scenario for all of our regional centres. So I think that constraint applies particularly to our larger places with those higher property values. The drivers and the responses are really different in our smaller places. So if you think about a place where the property prices are in that sort of around that sort of $250,000 mark, the real problem there is this barrier to finance that sort of touched on here, where there's generally small numbers of transactions. The value of those transactions is relatively low, around 250,000. It's much less than the value of new property. And in that situation, banks won't lend. They won't lend partly because they're not allowed to lend because they've got to balance that risk in those tightened regulatory environments since the global financial crisis. They've got to be much more careful about how they manage that risk. So we know that the banks, in looking to lend in these lower value, smaller volume markets, are really demanding much higher levels of deposit from homeowners, and in many cases making the purchase or the building of a new property unfinanceable at the individual scale. And that's a particular issue for our smaller places. And again, it's sort of compounded by the fact that we haven't really mapped out a growth scenario for most of those places as well. So what do we do about it? Like Julie's approach, you know, there's a mix of things that should be done, I think, at local, regional and national level. At the national level and actually at the state level in New South Wales, I have a somewhat strange plea as someone who's really passionate about regional development. Can we please slow down some of the rush to build things in our regional places? We know that this is pushing up the prices, it's pushing out the delivery times. There's a lot of concrete being poured across New South Wales, a lot of concrete being poured across regional Australia at the moment. Great time to do it because interest rates are low, but man, we are not coordinating across agencies, and it's a real schmozzle. We know that we're starting to get very poor value for money for some of these large scale investment projects now, and from a housing point of view, it's just sucking up all the tradies. So if we could just slow down a little bit of that, that would be great. I was in a regional council meeting about 6 weeks ago. They were concerned that state government, fantastic idea, you know, is going to rebuild $500 million worth of bridges in regional New South Wales. That's fantastic. but the capacity to do that is really limited. So the price is going to go up, it's going to suck tradies out, and it's going to make our housing problem even more difficult. So if we could start to stage that stuff and think a bit sort of whole of government, that'd be really cool, because that would allow us to put more resources back into housing, residential housing, rather than just capital works. We're also talking about a regional home buyer guarantee along the lines of the first home buyer guarantee that NIFIC, this National Housing Finance Corporation, is offering. But we'd also like to see a revival of in-region trade training. We've seen a reduction in the ability to do that trade training in region, although that's become centralised, and we'd like to see that dispersed again. State government, we look at stamp duty and development costs. A number of people have touched on those. I think it's important for the state to look as a whole at, or a region to look at what the scale of undersupply in a particular region and work out what the investment opportunity is for that. We've just done some work in Western Queensland, which shows that even in our quite remote areas, there's a significant volume of product that's needed, and the market is strong for that. So it's about a matter that helps to build a business case for different investors to come in. And lastly, at the local scale, bring land to market. I think a lot of our councils are really good at having a sort of a steady supply. There is a question around the resourcing of the infrastructure needs to bring that land to market, which is got to be shared between state and local. There's also, we know that there are difficulties around the ways in which temporary or relocatable housing options are seen in the planning scheme. I think that's right for review. And lastly, one of the things that we've learned in our remote study in Western Queensland is demand for sort of multi-unit townhouses and multi-unit dwellings is actually quite high, even in our quite remote and very small markets. So let's not discount, it's not everybody wants a large house on a large block, even in our smaller towns. So making sure that our planning schemes and our zoning enable that sort of medium density, even in our smaller places, is good, because that'll help to meet what the market wants. And of course, there's a sort of price benefit, because those things are cheaper to buy and cheaper to build too. So I know I've rushed through that a little bit, but I just wanted to touch on some of the drivers as we see them behind some of these structural issues. There is a big difference between our coastal and our large centre markets, which are sort of constrained more by a lack of vision on growth than by anything else. Compare that with our inland markets, which are really constrained by a lack of ability for pretty much anyone to get finance to build some new properties, and they require quite different responses. So I'll leave it there, Genevieve, and look forward to some questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Kim. And look, we've got time for sort of 6 or 7 minutes worth of questions. We're going to have a very short break at about 10:35. So I'll go through these and again try to amalgamate the questions that sort of sit together. Julie, I might go to you for the first one. This is Tim Renwick from Push for the Bush, who says, again, infrastructure levies are announced, yet we're in a forum dealing with housing affordability. End user that pays this, not the developers. What's your response to that?
Sorry, Genevieve, could you just repeat the last part of that?
Tim says, we're in a forum dealing with housing affordability, and yet we're talking about infrastructure levies. It's the end user that pays this, not the developers.
Yeah, that's very true, but infrastructure levies are important from a council perspective, because they're the things that we utilise. So if you're talking about the section 7.11 contributions or section 7.12 contributions that developers pay, they're the things that go to paying local roads, library, the services that the residents will actually utilise when they come to your town. So, they need a house, which is great, and they need an affordable house, which is great. But they also then will want to have all the services that they expect to support the lifestyle that they want. And that's where that funding goes to. So when we're looking at contributions, what we do recognise, though, that there is a lead in time before developers actually get some kind of return on what they're doing, and that, maybe setting milestones for payment of those contributions would be a better way of doing them, matching them up with when the earnings are made, rather than forcing an upfront contribution might make it more palatable.
And just a comment for you, Julie, from Graham Walker, who says he concurs completely with the matrix. The overarching issue that's missing is regional volatility to downturn, droughts and the like that impact on investment thinking. Nola, I want to go to you with a question about community housing providers and housing for refugees and migrants. Are you working with community housing providers to design housing that's designed especially for that sector? How do we begin these conversations about appropriate migrant housing?
I think it's actually a conversation that has to be initiated collaboratively between the community housing providers, the settlement providers, and the federal and state governments, because they all have a perception of it. I would have to say, and Wendy, I know, is presenting later today, but from Argyle, but from a community housing perspective, is where does settlement housing sit in that space? It's it's briefly touched upon. It's initially private rental, and it's effectively being managed in that private rental market with support through settlement agencies. It becomes it's a very different model to how community housing generally operates. And so there is a question there about how that should change. As I said, also from our client perspectives, the expectation about, and the experience is that they actually do need those longer term sustainable rentals in that space, but then the style and the shape of housing is also comes into play in that, when particularly they may also be subsequently bringing in other family members as well. So in that sort of space, I think the conversation has to start somewhere. I think that we've got some projects going on in this region and in the Murray region where we can begin that, where we're bringing state and federal government into that local conversation with the service providers. But I think really critically, we've got to get the community housing group in there. But and I think the other group that needs to be involved are those investors and those local builders that are contributing to the availability of housing in those areas.
Just very, very quickly now, can you make a comment on the support service systems for refugees who move to the regions?
The main difference is that in the regions, we generally have a generalist system of government and human and social services and supports, and then we have a very limited range of culturally diverse specialist services that respond to those, and that's the big challenge. Whereas in a major city, you will have multicultural health services, you will have multicultural education and English language services in. And they're very accessible because of public transport and because of density of population to areas and things like that. In the regions, it becomes much harder when you particularly look at that idea of a regional settlement. While your bigger centres may have some basic infrastructure to cope with that, how do you actually enable people who want to live in those smaller places outside those centres to access those services like English language at TAFE or skill training? One other comment I'll just make very broadly on this in terms of that is most humanitarian migrants that come in, or many of them, have skills, particularly in the building trades. What they don't have is qualification recognition, and they also don't have English language. And they're the two things that we potentially can work very closely to actually change our approaches to how we do that to improve the availability of those skills in regional areas through migration.
Yeah, and look, we do have a couple of comments from people saying, well, we've got a skills school on one hand, and then we've got migrants wanting to move to the regions on the other hand. Surely we've got a solution embodied there. Peta Gilhome, just a couple of quick questions for you. Lots of plaudits for the depth of that data and lots of requests about how people in various regions can access the kind of data you talked about. But specifically, a couple of people have said, given the level of mining activity in the Dubbo regional footprint, do you think that the data is influenced by mining? Are there sort of specific uplifts going on because of particular industries?
Look, I think every one of our regional markets has its own dynamic influences, and that's why it's so interesting to deep dive and look at individual markets together. I can't speak from too much of a depth of experience in the Dubbo market long term, but West Wyalong was mentioned previously, and it's certainly one of the markets that I've worked in over the last 8 years, and mining's definitely had a significant impact on that town and its vacancy rates. The wonderful thing is you get this vibrancy to towns when they have these great economic drivers, and West Wyalong's main street went from being somewhere you could choose from 150 different places to park, where now you almost have to do a couple of laps of the main street. And, you know, we all love that, but it does bring challenges. So look, absolutely, there would be individual drivers in individual markets, and the smaller the town, the greater the impact of a large economic driver will have on its property market. We've seen towns like Griffith, for example. Griffith's median's 480,000, which is well above what we're seeing in Wagga. And, you know, when you look and deep dive into these markets, and, you know, councils are a great source of knowledge on this too, every market has its own little dynamics or bigger dynamics that will drive it. So yeah, absolutely, mining's a big one. The uptick in ag is a big one. Dubbo would certainly have seen some flow on from that. A lot of downsizing and aggregation in that big rural and agribusiness sector too, with people moving off farm or particularly looking for off farm investments in their local communities. And, you know, all of those drivers would absolutely be contributing.
And we've had a number of requests from people about the infrastructure spend and where that's being directed. If you're interested in that, the infrastructure spend details are available at rdaorana.org.au, all one word. Kim, just to you finally, before we just have a very quick 5 or 6 minute break, what's the suggestion on supporting housing growth in areas where finance isn't possible? As you mentioned, that's absolutely an issue for a number of much smaller communities, that it's really, really difficult to get the banks to be even interested. And the question here says, especially where the volumes required makes them considered commercial. Is there a solution?
Well, there's no quick one. I mean, this has been, you know, this problem's been around for almost 10 years now, and it's what's, you know, really underlying this underinvestment in a lot of our smaller communities, unfortunately. We've got two sort of strategies there. One is, you know, if you think about what the federal government announced in the May budget was a sort of 10,000 places for single parents to access a home loan guarantee along the lines of the first homeowners grant. We're advocating for the same sort of approach being taken to regional housing in markets where there is clearly a market failure because the cost of new homes is well above the cost of established homes. That kind of picks up those particular markets. So same approach. The Commonwealth would actually guarantee a proportion of those loans. It doesn't have to be a larger proportion than it's already guaranteeing for these other constituencies, single parents and first homeowners. So that's one option. The other option that's come out, I think, through our work in Western Queensland is, while a number of these, you know, while the constraint has been large in very small places where there are sort of small volumes of building and small volumes of people wanting to buy, these can be aggregated to some degree, and it may be possible to sort of set up some sort of overarching regional housing trust, which would support construction and reduce the costs and take it down a completely different financing path, because you've got a trust there which is able to manage the construction and then ongoing sort of maintenance and management of a larger portfolio. That takes you out of the individual housing loan market.
Okay, look, thank you very much to all of you. And I'm trying to cover as much territory as I can here with the questions that are flooding in, which is terrific. But thank you to Kim Houghton, to Julie Briggs, to Neil Barber, and to Peta Gilhome. We're going to have a very short break now, and we'll come back in literally 6 minutes' time at 10:45 to talk about successful projects and initiatives. And the hope here, of course, is that these are things that you can put to use in your own thinking about solutions for inland housing issues. Thank you all very much indeed. We'll see you again very shortly. Thanks to all of our speakers.